A very complex issue with, as you say, lots of emotions and politics all wound up together.
It is a hot button topic, and it doesn't help that it just keeps evolving and changing, and we just have to keep reacting. The bottom line is
very complex.
Very complex, yes. Was there something else?
No.
Okay, all right.
That's
Sorry.
a special echo loop.
Oh, great. And we got that to deal with too. I appreciate you all letting me tune in virtually. I'm moving virtually over to another meeting on exactly the same topic when we've concluded. So this was the only way that I could quickly drive the needed mileage. So back in 2019, Martin v. Boise was decided. I know you're familiar with that case, but at that point, the Ninth Circuit of Federal Court placed the responsibility for homeless individuals squarely in municipalities' laps, cities and counties. And from that point forward, you've been unable to completely prohibit sitting, lying, sleeping, essentially keeping warm and dry in all public places throughout the city. So law enforcement has been threading the needle carefully from that point on to ensure that the way that your existing code provisions are applied aren't unfairly focused on unhoused individuals. So the first prong, that Martin v. Boise prong, that was more recently refined this past fall in what became Johnson v. Grants Pass. That was a second case decided by the Ninth Circuit, the federal Ninth Circuit. Johnson expanded Martin v. Boise's holding under the Eighth Amendment. So it's unreasonable punishment under the Eighth Amendment to punish individuals for sitting who have no other alternative for sitting, lying, sleeping, keeping warm and dry outdoors in public places. And that was expanded to not only criminal penalties, but civil penalties under the Grants Pass case. And it includes sleeping in cars, we learned. So that was kind of the big change. It also, Grants Pass had attempted to be clever and wasn't prohibiting people from sleeping in public places, but they were prohibiting them from having pillows, coats, blankets, tents, sleeping bags, etc. And that was found to be cruel and unusual punishment to remove those items. That's when really that keeping warm and dry aspect was added to the federal constitutional body of law. Now, that's the constitutional side. So you can fix the constitutional problems by not enforcing certain provisions of code that may violate that Eighth Amendment. But the Oregon legislature may be in concern that the cases were going to be appealed to the US Supreme Court, and that body of law would be repealed, it would go away, wanted to codify that law in state statute. And so we are now kind of racing against the clock. July 1st, 2023, ORS 195.530 goes into place. It takes effect. It was adopted by the 2021 legislature, but it takes effect this July. And what it did was attempt to codify Martin v. Boise in the Grants Pass case, but it states, it expands it so that it isn't just an as applied challenge. Any code provision that you have that is unreasonable from the perspective of a homeless individual and restricts their right to sit, lie, sleep, keep warm and dry on public property is subject to challenge. And a successful challenge could result in the city paying the plaintiff's attorney's fees. So you don't even have to enforce problematic provisions against unhoused individuals. They simply need to point them out in your books. And if you haven't repealed them or amended them to become reasonable, you're subject to that challenge and paying the attorney's fees of the plaintiff. So that is a very quick overview of the laws that are affecting you now, both the constitutional laws as well as the statutory laws. One involves enforcement of your existing code. The other, really why we're here, is to talk about modifying provisions of your existing code so on its face it's reasonable from the perspective of an unhoused individual. Do you have questions about that? Because I'm guessing you do.
Counselor Fox?
Yeah, so a generic law question. Does this July 1st number, I can't remember, nullify all counties' laws and provisions that may conflict it?
Cities and counties both need to come into compliance with 195530. That's correct. So both city and county laws that that completely restrict access of unhoused individuals to public property that's otherwise opened to the public, from sitting, lying, sleeping, keeping warm and dry, are subject to challenge. So let me drill down a little bit.
Counselor Lehman, just a minute. I am sorry, Carrie. Counselor Lehman has a question.
So 195-530, what in a sidewalk, which is pedestrian travel, not intended to be obstructed, but if a person is laying down and sleeping in a sidewalk, does that conflict with the current law on that, or is that and supersede that provision?
No. So I think this is a great segue into the nuances of the law. So what you are allowed to do is adopt reasonable time, place, and manner regulations so that public spaces are able to be enjoyed by and used as intended by all members of the public. So you do not have to leave all public spaces open all the time to every member of the public, including unhoused individuals. You're allowed to adopt those time, place, and manner. And we think that restricting obstructions of public sidewalks, streets, right-of-ways is reasonable, so that there's a safety purpose behind having sidewalks and having them available for use by pedestrians.
Carrie, would you like us to hold questions until you finish your presentation, or ask questions as they come up?
Let's just, I gave you, that down and dirty overview. What I want you all to do is to understand the law, and then we'll move into an examination of your code provisions. But I do want to also emphasize one of the aspects of evaluating code provisions is to determine where can people sit, lie, sleep, keep warm and dry in an unrestricted manner in your community. That's something that you might have a better handle of. Certainly your law enforcement is aware of, and city staff has been evaluating. And so that's probably before we turn to policy discussions. We're going to get the law down. We're going to talk about those facts, and then that will set you up to be able to discuss policy of what provisions do you want to change and how do you want to change them.
Okay, thank you. Counselor Fox, did you have a question?
No, we can get.
Okay. Okay, so you're on, Carrie. We're listening.
Okay, so let's, I'm looking primarily at my memorandum. That's 5 pages, 6 pages long. And I'm just kind of curious if anybody has any questions about that law portion. I'm looking at, let's see, I'm on page, sorry, I'm scrolling, I don't have it. So page 4, under the current law, we can conclude, we can also conclude. So the 8th Amendment, the constitutional prohibitions don't limit the city's ability to evict homeless individuals from particular public places if there are other places for individuals to go. So a lot of the analysis looks at alternatives. If you can't be here, where can you be? And that's the question you're just going to hear staff asking over and over, and that's the question that I want you to evaluate when you're considering what areas, if any, are we going to open up? What areas, if any, are we going to close? So you need to have sort of an inventory. You can prohibit sleeping in public parks as long as, again, there's other public areas, including right-of-ways for cars, sleeping in cars, available to unhoused individuals. You're not prohibited from clearing out specific homeless encampments because the 8th Amendment doesn't require you to allow access to public property indefinitely. However, there's another statute. It's actually been on the books for some time, but it was amended by the 2021 legislature. And it is now in 195-505. I outlined that in here as well, because you need to keep in mind if you're clearing out what is, we don't know what constitutes an established campsite, but if it's an established campsite, it requires 72 hours notice and certain storage requirements, storing personal property materials for at least 30 days, and a couple other statutory requirements that apply to that process. I am confident your law enforcement is familiar with these procedures. They are embedded in Lexipol, if that's what your law enforcement uses for their internal policies. But I raise it so that you also are aware of the two sets of statutes that are separate, but, you know, intertwined. And then also the 8th Amendment doesn't create a right for homeless individuals to occupy any public space of their choosing. So again, you get to prioritize public space. Do you want to protect your sidewalks over your parks? Do you want to protect your sidewalks and parks over your greenways? Those are the policy decisions that you're going to be talking about shortly. So then my memo talks about that 195-505 that we just discussed. The primary piece is that if something constitutes an established campsite, and again, that term is undefined, we don't know what it is. It could be anything longer than what your, you know, if your code allows parking for 72 hours and you haven't enforced that parking restriction, maybe something that goes beyond 72 hours is an established campsite. We're not sure. So it's always important to determine, or to ask the question, would this be an established campsite? Do we need to give 72 hours notice before moving somebody along? What we do know, so next steps, obligations imposed by COBRG or on COBRG by state and federal law. That's towards the end of my memo. The first thing was, so you're obligated to cease imposing sanctions for camping, sleeping on public property when no alternative shelter is available. You fortunately don't have a citywide camping ban, so there's no absolute amendment that is required under that Johnson v. Grants Pass. Grants Pass, as I mentioned, tried to eliminate public camping citywide. It closed every public space to camping. That was deemed unconstitutional. You don't have a similar ban like that, unlike other cities, even in Lane County. So that was the first thing I looked for, and you don't have that in your code. So now I move into certain provisions that I do recommend repealing because they're unwieldy. This 5-day cumulative parking limit on motorhomes used to transport or house the operator or the operator's family, that could easily be interpreted from an advocacy's perspective as targeting unhoused individuals. And because you already have a parking limit on your city streets that I believe works effectively for law enforcement, we recommend repealing this 5 cumulative day parking limit. Your definition of the term park is incredibly broad. It includes developed parkland and undeveloped parkland. And if you were to omit undeveloped parkland from that definition of parks, you might be able to retain the restrictions. You don't allow overnight camping. You don't allow sleeping in your parks overnight if there's other areas which are open for individuals to sleep in. I spoke with your city manager earlier today. I had previously sort of assumed that your overnight park closure restrictions could remain, that those would be reasonable limitations on use of your public spaces in the city of Coburg. I am not so sure, so that is part of the conversation that we hope to have with you a little bit later. But were you to amend the term park as I recommend, at least you would be narrowing the scope of where those restrictions apply and opening up other areas to potentially lying, sleeping, keeping warm and dry, sitting, lying, sleeping, keeping warm and dry.
Question?
Yes.
Counselor Fox.
So, yeah, I look at the verbiage that I gleaned and when I think of a person without a car and has no tent, and it's a nasty night, there's no mention of public restrooms, and that's a covered enclosed. And so, and then if you have to find an alternative, that's a public place. You have to create a covered shelter as such.
So, yeah, that's such a good question. Johnson is based, they used this phrase where they were saying sitting, lying, sleeping, keeping warm and dry is it's like part of the human condition. Well, so is using a restroom. So the case does not extend to restroom facilities. It doesn't talk about you need to make those available to unhoused individuals. But we're recommending that if you are going to say this space is open and exclusively we are only putting people there, you know, of all the public spaces in our city, the only place you can go is here, have restroom facilities and garbage facilities, sanitation facilities available.
I was expecting. but okay.
Did you want?
No,
to
I don't.
clarify this, or- Okay.
The kind of the flip side of that is if there are a number of places available, you don't have to have restroom facilities open everywhere. So it's, there's a lot of gray in these conversations and there's no hard and fast rules. But I can tell you if you're going to open property to a managed facility or the sole facility, you're funneling people into one place only and telling them not there, but here, you want to treat it like a camp.
Right, and I wasn't thinking of treating a restroom like a camp. I was thinking for safety reasons, that's not the best place to be walking in on someone. But
And maybe I misunderstood your question. Well, I thought you were asking about providing restroom facilities.
no, I wasn't, about sleeping in restroom facilities and camping out there.
Oh, you can lock those, you can close those. Unless, like I said, you're funneling people to a particular location, but you can maintain hours for your restroom facilities.
Counselor Lehman.
But piggybacking with that, if it's open and it's raining and cold outside, an unhoused person go into our public restroom in the park and sleep there during the day. Or just stay inside there to stay warm and dry. Or can we say that's not the intended use of this facility? You cannot continue to stay hour upon hour in the restroom.
All of this law on its face applies to outdoor locations. So it doesn't include enclosed city facilities, including City Hall, including restroom facilities. So you're able to maintain, I mean, as long as you're not treating anyone differently from anyone else, it's open for the use that was intended.
I have just 3 other questions. I'll rattle them off really quickly and add them all to one answer.
Mhm.
If a campsite has a fee that's charged, like Armitage Park, let's say, it's a public space, I believe, and somebody who's unhappy, I refuse to pay, or can you still enforce payment for that. Another question I have, I see Eugene's Park underneath the overpass. They fenced it off for the last several months, saying the park's under repair. I wonder how long they're gonna be under repair. Can you cite the unhoused people if they sleeping and staying dry and warm, if they're littering in the public spot?
So you just cut out right at the end of that. I think what you were asking is while you might need to allow somebody to occupy public space, do you have to allow them to violate other laws? And the answer is no. You can enforce other code provisions. But you do want to be reasonable. For instance, you know, just like City of Grants Pass tried to get tricky and outlawed or forbade erecting tents and using blankets, pillows, etc. So to the extent that somebody is doing, you know, has all of their belongings with them because they have nowhere else for them to be, you wouldn't cite them for garbage because they are moving that material around. But if they're actually creating unsanitary conditions or garbage, maybe you wouldn't cite them, but you would certainly be able to address the situation. So moving back to your fee question, if a location is subject to fees and those fees if there's no code mechanism or other mechanism to waive that for unhoused individuals, then that location can't be considered part of your inventory that's open public space.
And Carrie, my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if we're going to funnel people without homes into certain areas, they have to be within our city limits.
Oh, yes, yes. All of the
Yes.
public space that is part of your inventory, you are charged with determining what within our city boundaries is available. And you have to have locations that are available and unrestricted for.
And we
unhoused people.
cannot force people to move outside of our city limits unless they want to do that. I mean, they can't, we have to figure this out within our city limits. That's my understanding, that some cities have come together and said, well, I have money, one city has money and one city has land, and they tried to do a joint shelter area, and that didn't work for the city without land. And I think that was North Bend and Coos Bay, if I remember correctly. And it was, no, you have to have it within your city limits.
Absolutely, that's true.
Councilor Fox.
So this is going to the other end of the possessions of the individual. And they're camping in the once and future identified area. And they go off to truck stop to freshen up or whatever. Then they decide to hitchhike and they leave their stuff. And then our police chief shared with us that at least in Oregon, the possessions need to be respected. And, you know, is there guidance for how long possessions before they can be scooped up and put in a storage unit? A, and B, how long they have to be in a storage unit before it's considered abandoned goods?
Great question. So that is the target of that 195505. It's that discusses established campsites. And to the extent that that individual's materials and personal belongings are part of an established campsite, and we don't know what that is, so it's safer to assume that they are than that they're not, then you are required to provide 72 hours notice before dismantling the camp. And once you've dismantled it, you can discard things that are clearly unsanitary or unusable, but everything else needs to be maintained within the city boundaries near that established camp and accessible to the individual for 30 days.
Questions answered? Yes. Okay. Thanks, Carrie. I think we're good.
And believe me, I have gone over this material again and again with the same council, because questions just keep coming up and there's just different permutations of the way it applies to different situations. So, keep it coming. But if you don't have more questions for me, this may be a great time to involve your staff and find out what they've learned in terms of available public spaces and your homeless population, because it's really a calculus of, is there enough public space to serve our homeless population? And what is that homeless population? Does it fluctuate? How often does it fluctuate? Is it going up? And if it's going up, do we still have enough public space available to
If-
those
how about-
individuals?
You want to join us up here? Or wherever you want to be, and I know that Public Works could probably also have some input, but we'll start with the chief.
There's a lot to talk about. So a couple notes. Lexipol is a accreditation industry standard for law enforcement, and it's federal, state, and law enforcement best practice. We do belong to that, and our policies are Lexipol approved. So we are part of that particular policy with Gordon Graham through Lexipol. So good policies. Ask a fee or a question about fees. So if like Eugene Camping World charges a fee for camping, they would have to abide by that, or they could be arrested for theft of services or a criminal trespass. So that's private property. And what we're talking about does not apply to private property. So currently at the truck stop, there's a motor home with a dark tarp over the top of it. There's been a pickup associated with that. It's been there for several days. The police department has done nothing because it's on private property. So that would be up to the truck stop to call us and for them to trespass that person if that's what they choose to do, as with any other trespasser. Property in the shed, we have a couple of shelving units with plastic totes specifically to put property in. If we find abandoned property, if we arrest somebody that has property, we're going to keep it for like 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. It varies depending on the circumstances of how we acquired the property. If it was an arrest, if it was abandoned property, or if it was the person was known to abandon the property. And that's in policy. I don't recall exactly off the top of my head, but we have plastic totes specifically to take care of the property that we might come across.
Chief, a question, are those labeled like with where you picked it up if you don't
Yes.
have a person?
We would do a property evidence sheet that we do on any time we seize any kind of property, whether it's evidence or property, date, time, location, and then if we do know who it is, all that information goes there. So all that goes on the property sheet that goes with that property, all the way through till we dispose of it, back to the person, hopefully back to the person.
Great, sounds like you have an excellent process. in
We do.
place.
And then also, I think, Carrie, from a previous meeting, that the where you can't transfer from a car to pedestrian to a car, that's still in effect. But that's a good ordinance to keep.
I didn't find a problem with that because it didn't seem to prohibit unhoused individuals from accessing public property.
Okay.
And specifically sitting, lying, sleeping, keeping warm and dry on public property.
Right. And so if we deal with somebody as far as the garbage, a lot of times people leave stuff behind. If we help them, like a couple of people wanted to go to the hospital, so we took them to the hospital. There might be some debris left behind. A lot of times there's cardboard from where they were laying and sleeping or on their tent on top. So Brian and I have worked together. So I call Public Works. Brian comes and picks that up. We're under those circumstances, we're not going to cite the person. We're trying to help them. And the last thing we want to do is prohibit, stop them from doing what they need to do. So we don't cite people for offensive littering. That's officer discretion, but I don't think we've cited anybody for that type of littering.
And I would agree with that policy choice. It's it's a good, it's helpful, it's reasonable.
And then, Carrie, I have a question. Do we need to post park rules? Do they have rules need to be posted if we exclude them from camping in certain hours? Does that need to be posted?
Well, I mean, that's less of a homelessness issue and more of I think that's a good best practice so that because of course, any rules that you enact have to be applied to everybody. You wouldn't be able to allow a couple picnicking and stargazing to enter a park that's closed, just like if you're enforcing it against an unhoused individual. And so no exceptions. That's one of the things to keep in mind as you're creating or changing the laws is you can't change them to target unhoused individuals. You know, for instance, storing RVs on the street. I think your 72-hour restriction is really reasonable because everybody has in-laws that come, you finish a vacation and you leave it on the street until the next day or 2 days later when you have time to unload it. So just remember as you're tailoring these or looking to tailor things that you want it across the board applicable to all citizens.
Right. And for the homeless population or traveling population in Coburg, last couple of days, we've had like 3 motorhomes at the Shale cul-de-sac. They're all gone today. So the officers just pay attention to see how long they're going to be there. A lot of them are short time, you know, a couple of days, and then they'll be gone. Currently, we have one that's in a travel trailer with a pickup down on Roberts Road. She was displaced from the fire. So she calls us every time she comes into town, which she comes in for medical appointments. She'll call us, she'll tell us how long she thinks she's going to be here, which is normally a couple of days, and then she moves on. So it's time, place, and manner reasonableness. So we really try to use that standard. Like after a council meeting this winter, I got called to Serenity Lane, so it's about 9:30 at night. The guy wanted nothing to do with the Eugene Fire Department or Coburg Fire. Didn't want anything to do with me. He camped right there on the sidewalk. Well, that was fine because it was 9:30 at night on a wintry night. There's no way that he would have obstructed anybody. So we let him camp on the sidewalk, which is a wide sidewalk in front of Serenity Lane. That was reasonable. So we let him stay there. If it's down at the corner of the Shale and Pearl, and it's, you know, on a Friday afternoon at 3, there's quite a bit of traffic for people walking from the truck stop over to McDonald's and across. So that might be something where we have him move out of the sidewalk because he's blocking pedestrian traffic. But it's time, place, and manner. And so it's a lot of gray and a lot of officer discretion. And we normally cite on the side of trying to help them in whatever capacity that means. That's why we started the CHEP program, Community Help Ease in Troubled Times. We buy them food, we buy them gas, we bought tires for somebody, we might buy a battery. So a lot of those are cars. But if somebody is on foot, we'll do whatever we can to assist. We've given them LTE bus passes. We've bought showers for them at the truck stop because the truck stop has showers available to the public. So we've done all kinds of things to help them. And so we get easily, and it varies, but we can get 4 or 5 a week, 4 or 5 a day. You know, it depends on the season, the weather. There's just so many variables. We can never predict it. But so far this week, we've had 4. And they've all moved on without any, you know, conversation.
Is your perception that the numbers are increasing?
Not really. We had 20 in one day. And we come to find out, I think it was a concert someplace. And they were traveling to that concert, and there was just a ton of people coming into Coburg. It was like 23 in one day, I think is the highest, which is quite a few.
Chief, do you have a sense of an average? Are you in the 1 to 2
Yeah, probably
range?
3 or 4 a week, probably, I think would be average. You know, some of them we might contact, some of them we just, you know, see them there and they're in a public space and, you know, we kind of note it and they move on. So it just varies. The McDonald's, the Shell, the truck stop, the fill and go all get quite a bit because it's coming off the freeway. Then we do have some ones that are here often. They're coming from like Eugene, Armitage Park, and they'll travel up here to Coburg.
Shift their
Right.
areas.
And they go back and forth.
What's the average length of stay?
Couple days, maybe probably average. You always have outliers. We had a motorhome that was here for probably 2 months. We ended up having to go there on a dispute, found out that because we didn't know who the guy was, he had an outstanding statewide felony warrant. We ended up, then miraculously, the motorhome got fixed the next day and was gone. And then we arrested him about a week later. So, you know, every once in a while, I have somebody that kind of pushes that limit. And that was one, because we were going to buy a battery for them. We were going to give them gas. It was always a changing reason for them to be there. And we worked with them for quite a while. We ended up towing one vehicle because it was stored on the street for weeks. We had it impounded. They were living in the motorhome, which kind of creates a problem. And then also part of the problem, if you do have to tow one, is it's about $2,500 to have one of those things towed. And this is like a 45 footer. And so number one, you're limited on who has the capability of towing something that big. So it gets very complex very fast.
Back road from Coburg to Springfield. Two things. One, there was a RV that was parked off to the side for long periods of time. That's public space and it's not approved as a parking space, but because they're homeless, are they permitted to park there? Or is the parking only on approved parking locations?
Well, I think what you're talking about is actually out in the county. So we didn't do anything with that. That's McKenzie View Drive and it does attract people down there. Because there's quite a few camps in the woods there. They have access to the river, Armitage Park across the bridge. You know, they have a bathroom and stuff for them. So I'm not sure what the county does. And then Carrie, I think we had talked to Junction City about if we do have a couple of dedicated spaces, we can give them a map. We can't really funnel them, but we could give them a map if they're like traveling from out of state. Like the last guy I talked to here last week, he was from Nevada. And so he would have no idea where the location was unless I gave him a map and kind of, you know, he was able to find it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to confirm we do have space for you. Here's where it is, where you can park legally.
And then we could
Depending-
like, I'm sorry, then we could put like where the bus stop is if they needed a bus, or I mean, I think we could use that as a tool to help them if whatever capacity we could.
And that's, of course, if your right-of-way parking, regular parking is either closed or the kind of vehicle that they're driving is prohibited from parking in a regular parking space.
That was just an idea.
Yeah,
Thank you.
One other question, you see a lot of
Councilor Lehman.
cities where they underpasses, they put in big boulders because they don't want somebody sleeping under the bridge. It seems like that would be a targeting of unhoused people. Where they put obstacles in place where they know people would camp. Because they don't want them to camp there. People want to camp there because it's under the bridge. They put these big stones there and prohibits them from.
Yeah, I think we need to, you know, really concentrate on Coburg. You're right. We certainly all see those things.
I was
But
asking about the law here.
yeah. So, well, I can address that just and bring it back to what we're talking about. So the rocks placed in public spaces isn't a law. It wouldn't be targeted by a challenge, but it certainly affects your inventory. So were various areas of public space taken out of that public space inventory, suddenly you've shrunk what is available, and is it reasonable in comparison to the unhoused population? it sounds like you're not gonna have as hard of a problem categorizing and inventorying your available public space. But I would like to hear a little bit now about what, because your parks are currently not available for overnight sleeping. They're not. So what other space is there, if anything? And if there isn't, that informs your policy choice. You're gonna have to choose some area within a park, change the definition of park, designate various parks that are available and are not available.
So Andy, you want to address or?
Oh, yeah, so the staff, Chief Larson and Brian Harmon and I went out for a drive, just trying to brainstorm around the city where it is that we could direct people. We don't have a ton of greenway or places that we can direct people. One I did, there's a picture there. The biggest picture is a Roberts Road, and there is actually a motorhome park there. Right now, was this morning. So there is somebody already there. That is relatively close to the freeway and close to some services such as a market, restaurants, gas, and so that for parking of cars or motorhomes, there might be somebody sleeping in that car. I don't know. There's an area of Roberts Road where you can park and then there's no parking. We might have to rethink that. But so for parking of vehicles, we thought this might be the best place for it. For tent camping or somebody who has nothing to sleep in, the area that we came up with, can you go to the next?
Is it, so you guys all have. So
Yeah.
you want slide 2?
It's probably this
Way
one.
down, it's slide 3. So these are all just pictures of Roberts Road. You can see that it's kind of an open space. You know, a long road that could possibly be a place that we could direct people to park. If we go to the next site, so the major parks that we have are right downtown. And so we were trying to think about safety of citizens, safety of the person who is unhoused, and also where is a space that we could provide garbage, drop a toilet. So if you go down to Trails End Park at the end, and right as you enter the park to the left, this is that space looking east. There is a grassy area that has some shrubbery around it. That is between the building and the south end of the ponds. It's a pretty good sized space. It's not totally level. It's level. I mean, I've camped in areas like that, in non-structured camp areas. But that is really the space we would probably want to put a toilet, have a toilet dropped and then and cleaned once a week at the beginning of the park, to make a toilet available and to make garbage cans available. I don't think we want to advertise that it's a campground or develop a campground there, but it could be an area that if somebody needed a place that we could direct them to it. My question for you, Carrie, is if we were to do this, and we have the 72-hour rule, so you can stay here for 72 hours. At the end of 72 hours, if we don't have someplace else for them to go within the city limits, we can't really make them move on, from my understanding. Is that true?
True.
True. Yeah. So when we're directing them there, we're directing them there and they're going to stay if they don't have any food.
And that means that then that puts the burden on the city to make sure that it remains safe and not dangerous and not hazardous, because you don't want to be telling people the only place they can go is somewhere that's going to endanger their safety. What I do like about this space is that it isn't overgrown with bramble, you know, whether it's level or not, it's available. And that's nice. It doesn't have to be mowed in order to be available, but it couldn't be overgrown with shrubbery and brambles and et cetera. So.
Question. On these designated areas that you're allowed to camp, do you have to have signage? And does a municipality have to provide an alternate space if somebody unhoused doesn't like his neighbor?
Oof, that is right in that gray area. So it has to be reasonable from the perspective of an unhoused individual. And that means that they would have a legitimate complaint if you were placing them next to something that was dangerous, something that was loud 24/7, somebody that was stealing their items, etc. But they don't get to say where they want to go. So they don't get to pick their alternative location, but you do want to be really conscientious. If those issues are coming up, you don't want to ignore them. And you want to have a conversation to figure out what would work for them and what would work for the city. Or how are you going to address with the other individual who may be violating the law?
And the original question about signage, do you have to define the area?
No, you don't. That's actually the chief mentioned that map. Would be certainly voluntary. That isn't something that you need to do. You don't need to call it out or advertise it. Unless, like we were saying before, it's regular city park space. You don't want to treat it differently from regular city's park space. But what would this constitute? What is that area? Because we could, if it is known as something in particular, like it's not a neighborhood park, it's not a community park, but it is an undeveloped greenway. If we just change the definition of the term park in your code, that would carve out that area after the amendments go into effect, your park hours wouldn't apply to that area anymore.
So it's a wetland with the trail. Basically what it is it's a established wetland park. It's at the end of the road, industrial road. And it is, that there's nothing there. There's a picnic table and a garbage can and a trail to view the ponds, and that's the whole of the park.
So Anne, I'm so sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Well, I'm looking at your section 2 of the ordinance you sent me, the A171. Section 2 defines park, and it means an area of land owned or controlled by the city, set aside and maintained by the city for recreation or relaxation. And it includes neighborhood parks, community parks, as well as limited use parks, which includes undeveloped greenways. If we put a period after community parks, would that cut this wetland park out of?
Is that area part of a formal park?
It's on our park master
Oh, the
plan.
park.
Yeah, I mean, it is a park. It's a designated, it is named. We received grant funds to the Oregon Park and Recreation.
Okay,
So I think it could be a greenway, but it's still a park as far as its name.
okay. So instead then, what you're telling me indicates that the section 15 that has those limitations, hours of use, sleeping and camping. So it currently says no person shall sleep in any park between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. So we would say sleep in any park except, and use the name of that park between the hours.
In designated areas.
Yeah, can you say designated areas?
Yeah, if the council wants to vest the city manager with that authority to establish where camping or sleeping would be allowed in city parks, so except as designated by the city manager, that would be the ultimate in flexibility. That's the way I would actually recommend that you go, because in the unlikely event that this designated park is filled to overflowing, or those problems come up between residents, that would give the city manager the opportunity to designate a different location for one or more individuals.
So if we're talking about this area that we think might work, could we define how many people can be in that place? Can we say there are campgrounds or a camping space for 3 individuals? Or 3 tents, or is that unreasonable?
Well, that would be, if you go the route that was just mentioned, delegating authority to the city manager, then that takes it out of the council's hands. And you wouldn't need to do that, which I wouldn't recommend having in your code anyway. And so then the city manager can sort of evaluate what's the amount of space that's available, how many unhoused individuals should be able to camp there, when is it that we determine we're at our maximum capacity. And then you've just given her the power to, which I always recommend, you need a release valve, so that if the designated area gets full, you need to immediately be able to pivot and point to other areas where people can go, because other places need to be available. And then if your population goes down, you could just do the reverse and restrict those public spaces that are available to unhoused individuals. But I never presume what a council wants to do. So I was talking with Ann earlier, I can talk to you about options. I'm like, yeah, I can go down that road, but there's a bunch of other roads too, depending on how you want to go.
Thank you. Questions? Councilor Fox.
So I guess, I'm thinking about the period, and if we have the period where you're suggesting the period goes, and we have this designated area in parks, that would automatically exclude our alleyways, which are around town everywhere. Or would it?
That is a different code section, because those are not parks, but yes, you would be able to, if you believe that you can house your unhoused population in that designated park area, then you get to restrict other public spaces, including alleys, which I believe are currently not available for parking for more than 10 minutes or 30 minutes or something like that.
But I want to be clear that if say we opened up this one area and then we deemed it that there's just too many people down there to be safe, then we get 2 more people in town, we have to find a place to house them. That's an alternative site. So we would have to come up temporarily with an alternative site till the population of the first site drops down. And then we would close the alternative site and just make the primary site available. And so that, yeah.
Could we designate the parking lot of City Hall as an alternate area? Or is that unreasonable? I mean, it's paved, it's not comfy.
Yeah, I mean,
Is that within the city manager's discretion right now? Because that wouldn't be, again, that's not a park.
No, it's
So,
not a park.
so as an enforcement issue, the city would be able to direct people to that location. As a code issue, I'm not sure if I don't.
We'll have to look at that.
we will have to look at that because I don't know that.
I'm not sure that that's even.
I don't know.
discussed in-
I'm trying to, in my head, I'm trying to come up with alternate areas
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm struggling.
Well, I mean, cities look to their rights of ways. They look to their sidewalks. They look to the green strips between the street and the sidewalks. I mean, all of those are public spaces, including then city facilities, public works yards, city hall parking lots, areas behind or around city hall. All of those are on the table for your consideration. And they rarely are areas where anybody wants to divert unhoused individuals, but they are part of the inventory. Or can be part of the inventory.
We got work to do.
So because we're on a bikeway. We have no camping in town. But we open up this space down at Coburg Industrial North at Trails End Park. And we have bikers with their bags on their bikes come through town and say, where can we camp? And we can't say there's no place to camp at this point. Or is it, or can we say we only allow this for the in-house? So you obviously.
Their own house for the night.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to say, if we're making it fair for, because we have to
Right.
make the availability of public space fair for everybody, then are we, I guess my question is, are we making it for only the unhoused, and can we do that? Or do we need to make it available for anybody that comes through town that says, I need a place to sleep for the night?
It's supposed to be, it's those who don't have other reasonable alternatives. So if they can afford, they have anywhere else to go, including a relative's house or a hotel or, a fee campground, and they are individuals with means, like bikers tend to be, then they don't qualify for those, taking up those spaces. It has to be with regards to persons experiencing homelessness. And even if somebody doesn't have plans for the night, doesn't mean they don't have access to shelter. So this is, you have now all entered law enforcement's fun that they've been having for 2 years, which is, who do we bend the rules for? Who qualifies for this treatment? It's been fun, hasn't it, Chief? We have no defined terms. We've just been thrown this.
This is an in-house question, but this is a snapshot. It could be 30 feet by 100 feet. Is that like a couple acres? What size what are we looking at?
Brian, can you help us out with I'm not good
A
at
large.
it's probably size of this room, maybe? Would you agree with that? Half the size of this room? Yeah, I guess, yeah.
And-
Yeah.
I don't know if it's quite as big as the council chambers. It's probably 2/3 that, for sure.
You could have several tents or.
So that's a formal park. What's beyond the park? Is that city property that's unincorporated? Right?
And then more than that, bigger.
And what about to the east, all the way to the east? I mean, I know the highway eventually, but,
It's the wetland and then the I-5.
so it becomes a wetland.
Yeah.
The city limits actually takes in the wastewater treatment plant, but I don't know if it takes in the ag land. Is that right, Ann?
That would be the north of the park.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it ends right there at the limit.
There is quite a bit of what I would consider green space. There's an access road that goes that we can access the park in the wastewater treatment outfall to the irrigation canal there that runs all the way back up to the wastewater treatment plant. Now, I bring that up, but I don't know if that actually is included in the city limits. That portion, I just don't know.
Have to look.
I think the access road and then it goes up and takes in the compound of the wastewater treatment plant. That's the reason why the treatment plant was able to be built there, is because we were able to put that into the city limits. But again, I don't know how far out you want people without means to be able to, how far out is too far out for people that have to walk, right? So this camp spot at Trails End Park is 0.75 miles from the Shell station. So it's almost a mile, 3/4 of a mile. And if you go further, then you're, a little bit more than a mile from Pearl Street.
But you're also dealing with muckland, so. Sounds like.
Well, the area back that is designated is fairly dry. I
Right,
would
but if
think.
you-
Yeah.
Marching
To
north.
the south, directly to the south on the other side of the tree line, there's a tree line and the berry vines and a creek. Muddy Creek. Is that Muddy Creek, Brian? That runs?
It's an irrigation canal that is owned by the Muddy Creek irrigation project.
Okay, so Hamilton Construction would be on the other side of all.
Yep, that's correct.
What is what it is?
I do have a couple questions for you, Carrie.
Oh, let's do it. It's 7:07 and I was just informed I should tune into my other meeting at 7:15. So
This will be real quick. When we do designate a spot and somebody decides to camp there, whose responsibility is it to put up a sign that says, John Smith has been here for starting on this day and can be here for 72 hours. How is Larry supposed to differentiate between who is who?
That is such a good question. I think it depends on how you want to work this area. It isn't going to be a managed camp. And so you probably want to you want to note for yourself which tent was put up when, but you're right, then the notice is going to need to be individualized per camper. And that would be law enforcement or public works responsibility.
And then
Combination effort.
the other question I had kind of piggybacks on that. Let's say John Smith decides to leave town and he leaves town with all of his stuff left in the park. How do we know that it's John Smith that comes back and takes his stuff? Right? So if we have to leave something in place for X amount of days, Larry can't move it, or we can't move it for Larry for, 72 hours plus. How do we know it's John Smith coming back to get the camp and it's not, Jim Smith that comes by and decides that John Smith's stuff is now his stuff?
Hopefully that's not our responsibility and that's like you
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, that's not a city responsibility.
Okay.
That's one of the hazards of living on the street is things get stolen all the time.
I believe that we need to have some kind of a liaison camp. And so that's what Larry and I were just speaking of, is that right now we don't have a designated officer. We probably would designate one at that point that would be able to check in with how long they've been there, when they arrive. That's something we would have to think about.
Unless you want to volunteer, Counselor.
Yeah, that's a lot of management. Is that what other municipalities are talking about, managing it so that there is a designated gatekeeper?
So there's a difference between a managed campsite and having a designated officer who's used to and trained to interface with homeless individuals. You're talking about the latter. I don't recommend that a city take on managing a campsite, a homeless campsite. That would be in partnership with a nonprofit or a religious organization. And while we're talking about that, alternative shelter locations can also be individual private property owners, homes or business areas. If they want to partner with the city and offer up backyards or church parking lots, things like that, there are programs that you can adopt to allow businesses, individuals, and nonprofits to increase your inventory in that way. So if you want to talk about that at some point, it's not this short-term matter that we're looking at to try to amend your code quickly, but that could be part of your longer-term conversation. And it's, I think, a great idea to involve the community, because the community is likely coming to you saying, do something, and you get to turn around and say, wonderful, help us. We have to do this together. So I'm not sure if I'm hearing actual direction at this point, and Anne, maybe I'll just leave it in your capable hands to sort of figure out what of the recommended changes does the council want to get behind, or if they want to talk about it again at a different date. But I'm happy to draft or review draft code amendments when that direction is received. The only thing I have down for sure is the looking at delegating authority to the city manager to designate various park areas that could be available for overnight camping.
Okay.
We have taken the ordinances, Sammy, not we. Sammy actually took your notes, and we took the ordinances that you have recommended that need change, and we have provided notes on them so the council and we can go through them or review them and be prepared to bring. So these are ordinances. Amendments, they require 2 meetings, first and second reading, a public hearing. And we have, in a perfect world, are doing this by June 30th. But Carrie shared today that she didn't think it was a huge deal if we didn't make it by that date, because we don't have a no camping ordinance in place. And so anyway.
The overnight park restrictions concern me slightly if it's true that you really don't have other public spaces available. But if in the interim you're saying sidewalks are available, you actually didn't, do you have a no obstruction provision, but it didn't prevent, if it didn't obstruct pedestrian traffic, you didn't prohibit it. And so for the short term, even those park overnight closures probably aren't subject to facial challenge.
But in the best case scenario, we get this adopted June 30th. Amendments. And you're saying you can help us with the final ordinances to go to council.
Absolutely. Happy to. My recommendation would just be to have one ordinance that then targets the various sections in the, whatever various ordinances we're amending and or repealing sections from them. It would be really easy, especially the way Sammy just set it up.
Sammy is amazing, isn't she?
Mm-hmm.
So Zan and Councillor Lehman.
So the parking lot that we have at IOOF, does that have a evening restriction, no parking after a certain hour? And if it did, couldn't that space be an alternative space for camping?
We would have to get permission from the IOOF for that, because we have a very set use as part of our lease with that. It's supposed to be for economic development and community gathering, things like that. There's some very specifics that we have to use that building for.
I'm just talking about the parking area.
Right, but
Yeah,
it's
but
the whole lease. And so anything other than what's named in the lease has to be by special permission of the IOOF. And So I don't know what they would say about that.
But a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, as we're looking for alternatives. Counselor Fox.
I kind of went from being relaxed about this to digesting it to saying that 2 weeks from now is May 9th and we'd have to have the first reading on May 9th.
Uh-huh. Yep, got it. You're no longer relaxed, huh? You have
You're away.
digested.
Guess we have a lot.
Oh,
of other-
Sammy,
You asked Lizzle if she's comfortable with emergency clause, I would think this would be a great example. And they're saying this is your deadline, so that would take us into June with the emergency clause. Are there a lot of people pushing back? I don't know, Carrie, if you can hear me.
I think I heard something about an emergency clause, and my preference, when we have had legislation in place since 2021, and I understand that Coburg has had a number of unexpected setbacks, but my preference would simply be adopted as a regular ordinance without an emergency clause, because I think it'd be harder to defend an emergency clause than it would be to say our code is facially sufficient. And
so we need the 2 readings. That's what you're saying, Sammy, unless we invoke the emergency clause.
And I'm so sorry, Sammy, maybe we were just saying the same thing. But I just want to take emergency clause off the table.
Well, I'm looking at time, Carrie, and thinking you need.
I better go.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It has been incredibly enlightening and thought-provoking. So thank you for your assistance in this.
You're so welcome. I look forward to continuing to work with you to get you across this finish line.
Okay, well, we're looking
right.
to it
Night,
too.
guys.
Bye.
Thanks.
We're just gonna watch the movie.
Yeah, Council Ingebretson.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, thanks to the staff and everyone for looking at this and coming forward with a few proposals. And I think the proposals that have been made seem very reasonable as far as the location of this Trails End Park and probably the on-street parking location. They seem to make sense to me. We don't have a ton of options, so we kind of have to work with what we've got. So I mean, if staff feels like they could prepare the revisions in time for the May 9th meeting, seems to me like I would be in favor of that.
You think that's doable? Yeah,
Yeah, like Carrie's offering to help
Okay.
us, and yes.
Okay. I think, in my mind, and I sort of went through this before, I've been thinking about this for a while because I've known this was coming. And really, truly, all I could come up with was what staff came up with. What I don't want to see happen, and I think our citizens would certainly agree with this, is I don't want to see a lot of vehicles starting to park and camp in our neighborhood streets. And so I feel very strongly that we have to come up for the good of, with alternatives for the good of Coburg. And I believe there will be perhaps pushback from our Parks and Tree Committee about the alternate site being out at Trails End. But I'm willing to work with them, and I know staff is too, in terms of them understanding why this is necessary.
And we definitely are loath to think that we wouldn't have a porta potty and a refuse spot.
And we would
Nice to
definitely.
camouflage it someone, so it's.
Well, and it is kind of tucked back. It would not, in my mind, and certainly correct me if you have differing opinions, but it would not impair or impede the normal use of the trail and the park by citizens. It is kind of tucked out of the way. It's a little different than having it in Norma Pfeiffer or Jacob Spores or on our neighborhood streets. And I have to be honest, I guess I'm probably a bleeding heart liberal in some ways, but my heart goes out to people. I cannot imagine for myself wanting to camp, to live in those sort of circumstances. And I think that many of the people don't want to, but that is their only alternative. And I want us to be, and I want us to be empathetic, and I certainly applaud our police department and our public works staff in terms of their empathy and sensitivity in trying to deal with this very difficult situation. Because I don't think that's always the case in other cities. And thank you for Fox.
So having a shotgun wedding of making this, even though we've had 2 years. It's undesirable, but if bright light bulbs came over in the ensuing year, you can always modify. If you want.
Yeah, and
So better to get it done then.
well, the reality is things are changing on a constant basis, and that's part of why cities, we're not the only cities here at the end, is because all of us were sitting back going, okay, well, that's what they said today. And then the next week we would hear something different, and there was, so it's an ever-changing thing that now now they've kind of said, okay, this is the rule, you have to do this by this date. But it's been ever changing. And so I think that, we've put it as far as we could and tried to come in before the deadline, but the reality is you may have to revisit some portions of it anyway. So next year at this time, you may have to be making other amendments.
I fully expect.
I
that
just
that's-
wondered if we did the amendments in one ordinance, if it makes it easier if environmental changes take place, that we repeal that one ordinance and everything goes back to the way it was. Is that,
I'm not familiar with putting them together in one ordinance and doing it. So I'll be interested to talk to Carrie about that. The way I read her, the code audit though, was that she was pretty much, or their recommendation was to be pretty conservative. So if it didn't outright violate that ORS, to leave it and stay with the intent of following the ORS, only get rid of a few things that completely, because she did say it is liquid, it's changing constantly. But, and as far as the ordinance, she's the professional.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
she'll help me through that.
we'll look to her, and she said she'd do it. So I think by May 9th, we can get it done. She's made some very specific in her memo recommendations to the council about what changes she thinks we need to make. And so I think it's not a lot, it's pretty simple. I think in C, I believe it was in her thing as designated by the city manager, she would be making a recommendation for where she wants that to go.
In the ordinances that you guys received, so the repealing pieces that she will be looking at this time are in red. So those would be the
Okay.
things that they're suggesting at this point are they're non-compliant with the law.
Okay.
On
There's not a
page-
lot.
No, there's not. It's on page, there's 2 repeals. On page 5 of A171. At the bottom of the page.
Oh, yeah, and it's not in a box. It just is
see it,
written
yeah.
in red repeal. Yeah.
And then,
This is an old ordinance too.
Look at the
It's been
typing.
in place a long time.
we can't even monitor, that's why it's in yellow little boxes, because
Uh-huh.
this is gonna have to be totally retyped to, actually amended.
Yeah, so I had explained to someone who was about 21 today what a clawfoot bathtub is. and this was done on a typewriter. and
This
no
is
one would
done
know
in
what that is.
1991. This is February of 1991.
It was on a correcting typewriter at least,
Yeah.
but it was a typewriter.
Yeah.
Here.
The other repeal was on ordinance A246, controlling the vehicular and pedestrian traffic. Page 9, under section 23.
I don't got red.
I didn't get 240, I didn't see 246, that was my, oh, I see, okay.
45.
Oh, where are you?
Is that section 23?
246
Yeah.
is here.
Page 9 of 19.
Yep. There's not a lot that needs to be repealed. And that really speaks, I think, well of Coburg. That very thoughtful in terms of how this was done. And truly, I think the lawsuits, they didn't come up that long ago, did they? Blake versus Boise, was that in like
Boise was only 2 years ago and then
Yeah.
Grants Pass was just
recent?
recent.
But
So-
like this last year, maybe. So it has been very fluid. I think it's been somewhat driven by the Ninth Circuit Court's rulings, been much driven, I should say. So while I think we feel like we're behind, I'm not so sure we are.
No, and I think most small cities are in the last couple months or are right where we're at. The other thing that has come up with the court rulings is the interpretation.
Yes.
So you're gonna see probably some clarifications because some of the interpretations of the rulings are they're just really hard.
Anything else for the good of the order? Comments? Opportunities to speak.
Try to make it brief. Try to make it brief. I think, this whole issue in my mind, I've been thinking a lot about it and I think we really lack in this country, housing that's just affordable to people that have to work for a living. We have a lot of housing for people who are upper middle class and up. And we don't have much housing at all for people who are minimum wage or working class. And that's our problem. That's our bigger collective
That is a
problem
huge
as a
problem.
country is we've got to figure out a way to these public-private partnerships, as Ann mentioned at a different meeting, to insist that we do have some housing that's a bit smaller and a bit more modest that people can actually afford.
Talking about that somewhat with the downtown development code, and I was just visualizing that the other day where 3 units and some of them, I'm looking at some of these houses in New York City, and they're gorgeous, and it's like 130 square feet or something,
Yes.
But they've figured it out really nicely. You can live in a small.
Yes. I think Counselor Blaine has done some work, if I remember correctly, in Mapleton, creating small homes. I do think that that's a problem and what used to be affordable is no longer. So, and wages have not kept up with property values and rent and, you for pointing that out, and thanks for thinking this through and great questions. And so we'll ask staff to work on redoing the ordinances with the intent of having first reading on May 9th.
And I'm just assuming you want to go with Gary's recommended changes to our ordinance.
Yes, I think so. I'm not seeing any dissent who's present, so definitely.
It would be great to get a draft before they.
Well, you would probably,
10 o'clock and-
There you go.
You can get that read before the
I would
meeting.
talk to Carrie tomorrow. I don't think it's gonna be that difficult. She's doing it for other cities right now, so I imagine they've done this a bit this year. So it would, in a dreamy world, we would have it in your packet. But we'll
We should
see.
be able to get it by the end of next week.
Yeah, yeah.
Get a draft out for you to take a look at. All right, well, if there's nothing else, I'll adjourn the meeting at 7:31. Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Brian. Was that Snoopy we heard?
Yes, it was.
Did you want to join in too?
He did. I'm sorry about that. My wife had to take him for a little walk.
No, it was. He had something to say.
Yes, yep.